In the summer of 480 BCE, at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a small Greek force stood in the path of the largest invading army the ancient world had ever seen. Led by King Leonidas of Sparta, just 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies faced the might of Xerxes, ruler of the vast Persian Empire. For 3 days, they held the pass against overwhelming numbers, using discipline, terrain, and sheer will to defy the impossible. Their stand would not stop the invasion, but it would ignite a legend, one of sacrifice, defiance, and the unshakable belief that some causes are worth dying for. The year was 480 BCE, and the ancient world stood on the edge of a storm. Across the Aegean Sea, in the gilded halls of Persepolis, King Xerxes I of Persia sat upon a throne that overlooked the largest empire the world had ever known. From the banks of the Nile to the mountains of Bactria, the Persian banners flew. Yet despite his vast dominion, his gaze was fixed westward, on a fractured land of fiercely independent city-states called Hellas. This was not the first time the great king had turned his eyes to Greece. 10 years earlier, his father Darius I had sent an expedition to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting a revolt in the Persian-controlled Ionian cities. That campaign ended in humiliation at Marathon, where a much smaller Greek force crushed the Persian army. For Persia, a power that measured its strength in armies of hundreds of thousands, this defeat was not just a military loss, but a wound to imperial pride. Darius had sworn revenge, but death claimed him before he could march. That oath passed to his son, Xerxes, a king whose ambition matched his empire's size. He would not send a mere expedition. He would come himself at the head of an army so vast that, according to ancient chroniclers, it drank rivers dry on its march. If Persia was a sprawling empire united under one ruler, Greece was its opposite. A patchwork of over 1,000 independent city-states, each with its own government, army, and ambitions. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful, were as different as fire and stone. Athens was a naval power and the birthplace of democracy, brimming with merchants, philosophers, and a restless citizenry. Sparta was a militaristic society built on discipline, ruled by kings and warriors, where boys were trained for war from childhood, and honor was measured in the number of enemies one could stand against before falling. For centuries, Greek city-states had fought each other as often as they traded, and unity seemed a distant dream. But the shadow of the Persian Empire, stretching ever closer, forced them into an uneasy alliance: the call to defend Hellas. In 481 BCE, representatives from dozens of city-states gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth. There, in a rare moment of cooperation, they agreed to set aside rivalries and form the Hellenic League, a defensive pact against Persia. Sparta was chosen to lead the land forces, and Athens would command the fleet. The strategy was clear: use Greece's narrow terrain and coastal straits to block the Persian advance, preventing their massive army from overwhelming the smaller Greek forces in open battle. One such choke point was Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow pass between mountains and sea. Whoever held it could halt an army many times their size. Back in Persia, preparations for invasion were unlike anything the world had seen. Herodotus claimed Xerxes assembled an army of over 1 million men. Historians today believe the real number was closer to 100,000 to 150,000, still vast by ancient standards. The forces came from every corner of the empire: Persian immortals in glittering armor, Assyrian archers with recurved bows, Babylonian spearmen, Indian war chariots, cavalry from Bactria and Sogdiana, Egyptian marines for the fleet. This was not merely an army, it was the empire itself, on the march. As the Persian host crossed the Hellespont on 2 massive pontoon bridges, Greece braced for war. For the men who would soon stand at Thermopylae, the politics were over. The time for speeches and oaths had passed. Now there was only the steel of the spear, the weight of the shield, and the knowledge that death was coming, in numbers too great to count. The road to Thermopylae. The spring of 480 BCE brought with it more than the scent of blooming olive trees. It carried the whisper of marching feet, thousands upon thousands, echoing across the lands of the Persian Empire. In the east, The war machine of Xerxes stirred, stretching from horizon to horizon, a living river of men, horses, and ships. The great king's plan was precise: crush the Greek resistance in a single, overwhelming campaign. To accomplish this, he would advance by both land and sea, his vast army shadowed by a massive fleet that hugged the coastline, carrying supplies, siege equipment, and reinforcements. It was an invasion designed not merely for victory, but for spectacle, a display meant to break the will of any who dared resist Persia. Crossing the Hellespont. Before the march could begin, Xerxes faced his first obstacle: the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. The Persians could not rely on ships alone to ferry such an army. Instead, Xerxes ordered the construction of two colossal pontoon bridges, each a marvel of ancient engineering. Hundreds of ships were anchored side by side, lashed together with cables of linen and papyrus, then covered with planks and earth so that an army could walk across. Herodotus tells us that a storm destroyed the first attempt, enraging Xerxes to the point that he ordered the sea itself punished with whips. Whether this tale is truth or embellishment, the second set of bridges held, and in a matter of days, the Persian army poured into Europe. From Thrace to Macedon, city after city submitted, either through diplomacy or sheer intimidation. For many Greek states north of Thessaly, the Persian arrival was not a question of if they would bow, but how quickly. Meanwhile, in the south, the Hellenic League debated their next move. A defensive stand would need a position that could neutralize Persia's advantage in numbers. Thermopylae was chosen for the land defense, a narrow pass flanked by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. Here, even the largest army in the world could be held at bay by a much smaller force. The Athenian general Themistocles, foreseeing that the war would also be decided at sea, argued for a simultaneous naval blockade at Artemisium, just north of Thermopylae. The plan was simple but daring. Land and sea defenses would operate in tandem, preventing the Persian fleet and army from bypassing one another. Sparta, the natural leader of the land defense, faced an inconvenient complication. A major religious festival, the Carneia, was underway. Spartan tradition forbade sending the full army to war until the festival ended, but the threat was urgent. Delay could mean the Persians marching unopposed into central Greece. King Leonidas the Fire took a compromise route. He would lead a personal guard of 300 elite Spartans, chosen for their experience and, critically, for having living sons to carry on their bloodlines. These were not fresh-faced youths, but hardened veterans who understood that the mission was more likely to end in death than in victory. The 300 would be joined by several thousand other Greek allies, 700 Thespians, willing volunteers who would fight to the end, 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was uncertain, but who were compelled to join, contingents from Phocis, Opuntian Locrians, and others, bringing the total Greek force at Thermopylae to roughly 7,000 men. Leonidas led his column north through the rugged Greek countryside. Villages emptied to watch them pass, whispers running through the crowds. The Spartans are going to stand at the hot gates. It was not just a march, it was a signal to all of Greece. If Sparta was willing to send her king to the front with only a personal guard, then the cause was worth dying for. On the third day of the march, the army reached Thermopylae. Before them lay the pass, a strip of land so narrow that in places no more than a chariot could pass through. On one side, the mountains rose steep and jagged. On the other, the sea churned against the shore. Behind them, the Persian horde advanced, a black wave rolling south. Leonidas ordered the construction of a wall from old Phocian fortifications, shoring it up with timber and stone. The pass was to be the anvil on which the Spartan spear would break the Persian hammer. From this moment, the road to Thermopylae was no longer a journey, it was a countdown. The defenders knew that the army coming for them outnumbered them beyond reason, but they also knew that here, in this narrow place, numbers would count for little. The hot gates were about to live up to their name. The first day of battle. The dawn broke hot over Thermopylae, the mist rising from the sulfur springs that gave the pass its name, the Hot Gates. The mountains loomed high and unforgiving. casting deep shadows across the narrow strip of land where the Greek line waited. Shield to shield, spear tips angled forward, the men stood silent, their breath steady, their eyes fixed on the road that vanished into the haze. From beyond the bend came the sound, faint at first, then swelling until it filled the pass. The rolling thunder of countless marching feet, the rattle of armor, the bray of war horns. And then, like a tide emerging from fog, they appeared, the vanguard of Xerxes' army. The first waves were not the elite troops. Xerxes, confident that the Greeks would be swept aside quickly, sent forward Medes and Scythians, warriors from the heartlands of the empire, armed with wicker shields, short spears, and curved swords. Their banners snapped in the wind, and the sun caught the bronze of their helmets. They surged forward in disciplined ranks, expecting to trample a token resistance. But when they met the Greek wall, they found not scattered defenders, but an immovable line, the phalanx. The clash of bronze and iron. The Greek phalanx was a living fortress. Each hoplite's shield overlapped the next, forming a wall of bronze and wood. From behind this shield wall, long dory spears stabbed forward in deadly rhythm. The Persians charged, their war cries echoing between the cliffs, but the narrowness of the pass robbed them of numbers. They could not envelop the Greeks. They could only smash headlong into the spears. For hours the fighting was relentless. The Medes pressed hard, but every advance was met with the same result. Spear points finding flesh, bodies tumbling to the ground, shields falling from lifeless hands. The Greeks rotated fresh men to the front line in shifts, an unheard-of tactic to the Persians, who fought until exhaustion overcame them. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Xerxes sent in his elite guard, the Immortals, so named because their ranks were always kept at 10,000 strong. Clad in fine armor and armed with spears and bows, they advanced with precision, confident in their reputation. But reputation meant nothing in the choke point of Thermopylae. The Immortals too found their longer spears snapping against the solid wall of Greek shields, their arrows clattering harmlessly off bronze. The Spartans and their allies fought with calculated discipline, feigning retreats to lure the Persians in before closing ranks and cutting them down. Herodotus tells us that the Persians fell in heaps, the living stumbling over the dead, the pass becoming a killing ground where mobility was impossible. By the time the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened across the pass, the ground before the Greek line was littered with Persian bodies. The sea breeze carried the smell of blood and dust. The Persians withdrew. Beaten back for the day, their pride bruised as much as their ranks. On the Greek side, losses had been minimal. The men cleaned their weapons, reset their shields, and ate in silence. They knew this was only the beginning. The next day Xerxes would come again, and he would come harder. The second day of battle. The sun rose again over the narrow pass, the sulfur steam curling around the Greek lines like ghostly fingers. The men had slept little. They sharpened their spears, checked their shields, and stared northward, knowing the enemy would come at first light. For Xerxes, the first day had been a humiliation. His elite Immortals had been bloodied and thrown back, and the cost in men was far higher than he expected. The great king was not accustomed to stalemate, certainly not against so few. The pass, he realized, would not yield to brute force alone. But pride is a dangerous commander. Xerxes resolved to break the Greeks through sheer persistence, sending wave after wave until the line shattered. The morning silence shattered with the sound of war horns. This time, the Persians advanced in larger, tighter formations, shields locked, spears thrusting forward. Units from across the empire, Assyrians, Scythians, and more Medes, surged into the narrow defile. The Greeks met them as they had before, the phalanx holding firm, spears darting like the sting of 1,000 serpents. Again, the narrow ground worked against the invaders. Their numbers meant nothing in a space where only a few dozen men could fight abreast. Leonidas rotated his frontline troops with precision. Fresh warriors stepped forward. Weary ones fell back to drink and rest. The Persians had no such luxury. Once committed to the crush of bodies, they could not easily withdraw. Herodotus writes that the Spartans fought with unnerving calm. Between charges, they would kneel to clean their armor or comb their long hair. not out of vanity, but as a deliberate display of confidence. To the Persians, these men seemed less like mortals and more like warriors preparing for an appointment with the gods. By midday, the heat of the pass was suffocating. The bodies of the previous day's dead still littered the ground, and the blood-soaked earth turned slick underfoot. Persian soldiers slipped, fell, and were trampled by their own comrades as they tried to force the line. Xerxes ordered his archers forward, and black clouds of arrows hissed through the air. But the Greek shields, large concave hoplons of layered wood and bronze, absorbed the volleys. Behind them, the phalanx advanced in short, brutal bursts, driving the Persians back. The Persians falter. By late afternoon, the attackers were exhausted. They had fought in crushing heat, against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move, in a place where retreat was as dangerous as the advance. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne positioned on a nearby rise, is said to have leapt to his feet 3 times in rage as he saw his men repelled. As the sun began to fall, the Persian assaults dwindled. Trumpets signaled a retreat, and once again, the Greeks held the pass. The defenders gathered their dead, repaired their armor, and prepared for another day. But while the Spartans and their allies celebrated another day's survival, danger was already winding its way through the mountains. A local man named Ephialtes, seeking reward from the Persians, approached Xerxes with a secret. There was a hidden goat path through the hills that would allow his army to bypass the Greek position and attack from behind. Xerxes listened. The trap was about to be sprung. The third day of battle and the betrayal. The third dawn at Thermopylae broke under an omen of silence. No horns, no marching feet, just the hiss of the sea against the rocks and the faint rustle of wind through the pines. The defenders stood ready, eyes fixed on the northern road, wondering why the Persians had not yet advanced. King Leonidas knew something was wrong. Years of command had honed his instincts, and they whispered that the enemy's pause was not mercy. It was strategy. Soon a Phocian scout stumbled into the Greek camp, breathless and pale. His words struck like a blade. The Persians are in the mountains. The night before, Ephialtes, a Malian Greek familiar with the terrain, had slunk into the Persian camp. For a price, he offered Xerxes what brute force had failed to secure: the narrow Anapia path, a twisting goat trail through the hills above Thermopylae. It would allow a detachment to circle behind the Greek position. Xerxes seized the chance. Under cover of darkness, he sent his elite immortals, led by Hydarnes, up the path. By dawn, they had already passed the Phocian guard stationed there, slipping through the mist to descend upon the Greeks from the rear. When the truth reached him, Leonidas called a council. The pass was lost. To stay meant certain death. Yet, retreat would mean opening the road to central Greece before the rest of the army could regroup. The choice was stark: flee and live in shame, or stand and die buying precious hours for Hellas. Leonidas ordered most of the allied contingents to withdraw, but the Spartans would remain. With them stayed the 700 Thespians, who refused to abandon their post, and 400 Thebans, whom some historians believe stayed under duress. In total, perhaps 1,500 men prepared to make a last stand. Knowing the end was near, the Spartans fought with a ferocity that defied the limits of flesh. Herodotus tells us they discarded broken spears and drew short swords, hacking and thrusting in close combat. The narrow pass echoed with the clash of bronze, the grunt of exertion and the cries of the dying. From the north, the main Persian force pressed forward. From the south, the immortals closed in. The Greeks were trapped between 2 tides of steel. The air filled with arrows so thick, Herodotus wrote, that the sun was blotted out. At the height of the fighting, Leonidas fell. Accounts differ on the manner of his death. Some say by arrow, others by spear, but all agree that the Spartans fought like men possessed to retrieve his body. 3 times they drove the Persians back to recover their king, and 3 times the battle swirled around his fallen form. Xerxes, furious at the resistance, ordered Leonidas's body mutilated, an act rare for the Persians, who normally honored the dead, but meant here as a final insult. With their ranks thinning and their weapons shattered, the Spartans and Thespians retreated to a small hillock at the rear of the pass. There they formed a final ring of shields. The Persians surrounded them on all sides, unleashing a storm of arrows. It was over. The defenders were buried where they stood, not in earth but in iron and feathered shafts. The pass was open. The road to central Greece lay before Xerxes. Though Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, it bought crucial time. The Greek navy regrouped at Salamis, where just weeks later, Themistocles would lure the Persian fleet into a trap and deliver a crushing blow. The land war would continue, culminating in Greek victory at Plataea the following year. But the memory of the hot gates lived on. In stone and in song, the Spartans' sacrifice became legend. On the site of the last stand, the poet Simonides' words were carved. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." When the last Spartan fell and the dust of Thermopylae settled, the Persians controlled the pass, but they did not control the story. That belonged to the Greeks. In the months that followed, the defenders' sacrifice became more than a memory. It became a weapon. News of the stand spread through every city-state, told and retold around hearths and in marketplaces. The tale of a few hundred warriors defying the greatest army on earth was not just inspiring, it was unifying. For the first time, Greece began to think of itself not only as a collection of rival polis, but as a shared culture worth defending.